Snow drifted in heavy silence across the old cemetery of Asheville, North Carolina. Under a crooked willow, a little girl knelt before a single grave, her knees half buried in white frost. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her small hands, red from the cold, clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit whose left ear was hanging by a single thread. The wind tugged at her thin blue dress as if trying to lift her away, but she stayed still, frozen in devotion. Before her the stone read, Robert Dawson, beloved, father, 1987-2024. Tears streaked down her cheeks, instantly turning to ice. She whispered through trembling lips, Daddy, I don't want you to be alone tonight. The rabbit slipped from her grip, landing softly in the snow beside a wilted flower. She reached for it, her fingers shaking too hard to hold on. Before we go any further, take a breath with me. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? If your heart has ever felt cold or forgotten, you're not alone here. Sometimes we all need a reminder that kindness still exists, even in the cruelest storm. If your heart feels heavy, may this story bring you a little light. Now, let's begin. A pair of headlights cut through the storm. A black Mercedes slowed at the edge of the cemetery road. Inside, Edward Grayson, a 52-year-old millionaire known for building an empire of grocery chains, tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had been driving home from another empty business dinner, lost in the noise of the wind, when the sight stopped him cold. A little girl, alone by a grave, crying into the snow. For a long moment he couldn't move. The image struck him deeper than reason, like a ghost reaching across years he had tried to forget. 10 winters ago he had buried his own daughter in weather just like this. He remembered her small hand slipping from his, the sound of wind howling through an unfinished goodbye. Edward opened the door. The cold hit his face like glass. He walked towards the grave, his breath visible, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in years. The girl flinched when his shadow fell over her, clutching the rabbit to her chest. Edward bent down, removed his coat, and gently draped it over her shoulders. Not tonight, he said softly. Not in this cold. The girl looked up, eyes wide wet and glimmering with the faintest spark of hope. And for the first time in a decade, the man who thought he'd lost all warmth felt something stir again, something alive. The snow had already swallowed half the town that winter. By morning, the cemetery lay under a blanket of white, soft enough to hide every footprint, except for 2 small ones leading to Robert Dawson's grave. Each week, Claire came back, walking the mile from the edge of town with her little stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The neighbours had stopped trying to ask why. They only saw a quiet girl in a hand-me-down coat whispering to the wind. But Claire knew. Her father loved snow. He used to tell her, when it snows the world gets a chance to start over. So she came back every time it fell, believing maybe her father could still see her, still feel her near. At home, things were nothing like before. The house that once smelled of apple pie and motor oil, the way her dad used to fix the heater, now smelled of perfume and silence. Marjorie, her stepmother, had moved through the rooms like a stranger claiming her new kingdom. She wore heels that echoed on the hardwood floor, sharp, and certain her every word perfectly measured for sympathy in front of neighbours and colder than frost behind closed doors. Her little half-sister Olivia never seemed to notice. At 4, she lived in a bubble of warmth. New toys, soft blankets, milk warmed just right. Sometimes Claire stood in the hallway watching her from the shadows, wondering what it felt like to be loved without earning it. On the night her father died, Claire had sat by his bed, holding his hand until it grew still. He had whispered one last thing. Take care of the rabbit for me, okay? It was the same toy he'd won for her at the county fair the year before the sickness. Now its faded fur carried the scent of everything she'd lost. When she returned from the cemetery, Marjorie only asked, "Where have you been, Claire?" without looking up from her phone. "I was with Daddy," Claire murmured. Marjorie's lips tightened. "Your father is gone. Stop pretending ghosts can hear you." The words sliced through her like wind through thin fabric. Claire didn't argue. She just nodded, clutching the rabbit tighter, retreating to her small room at the top of the stairs, a space barely warmed by the old radiator. She sat by the window, watching the snow drift past the glass. Every flake a whisper she could almost understand. Down the street, in another part of town, Edward Grayson sat in his car, the same grave still etched in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of that little girl in the storm. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. And now, for reasons he couldn't yet name, he knew he wasn't meant to. Edward Grayson didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window of his study, the city lights below blurring into streaks of gold and white. The image of the girl at the grave would not leave him her trembling lips, the stuffed rabbit pressed against her heart, the kind of loneliness that screamed louder than words. By morning, his mind was made up. He found her address from the cemetery caretaker and drove out before the sun fully rose. The Dawson house stood at the end of a quiet lane wrapped in white fences and perfect symmetry. It looked peaceful from the outside. As Edward stepped from his car, a woman appeared at the door. Marjorie Dawson was younger than he expected. Elegant, well-kept, her smile polished to perfection. "Mr. Grayson," she said sweetly, "what an unexpected visit." Her tone carried both curiosity and calculation. Edward explained softly, "I met Claire yesterday. She was at her father's grave in the snow. I just wanted to be sure she made it home safely." Marjorie tilted her head, her smile unmoved. "Claire has a wild imagination. She gets emotional, especially since Robert passed. Children need discipline, not pity." She called over her shoulder, "Claire, come say hello to our guest." Claire appeared at the end of the hallway, her small figure half hidden behind the doorframe. Her eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and relief. The stuffed rabbit was in her arms again, its ear neatly stitched with blue thread. Edward crouched down, lowering his voice. "Hey there, Miss Claire. You kept my coat warm for me." She nodded timidly, almost smiling. Marjorie's gaze sharpened the kind that chilled more than any winter storm. "She needs to learn responsibility," Marjorie said. "I can't have her running off to graveyards." Edward's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed calm. "Children grieve in their own way," he replied. Then turning to Claire, he brushed the snow from her sleeve, a simple gesture, but steady, certain. He reached into his pocket and offered her a clean handkerchief. She hesitated, then held it close like a treasure. "Don't worry," he said gently. "From now on, no one will make you face the cold alone." For the first time, Claire's shoulders eased. The faintest warmth returned to her expression, like the first light breaking through snow clouds. The following week, the snow thickened again, and with it came silence inside the Dawson house. From the street, it looked like a postcard, warm lights wreath on the door, smoke rising gently from the chimney. But behind those windows, warmth was a lie. Marjorie sat by the fireplace, her silk robe gleaming under the orange light. Beside her, little Olivia giggled softly as her mother braided her hair. From the kitchen doorway, Claire watched the scene quietly, the mop still dripping in her hands. Her fingers were red and cracked from cold water. "Don't just stand there, Claire," Marjorie said without looking up. "Finish mopping the floor before dinner, and wipe your shoes before you step on the rug." "Yes, ma'am," Claire whispered. When she bent down again, a faint shiver ran through her shoulders. The rabbit was sitting on the counter, half hidden under a towel. She had tried to keep it dry, but its fur was damp from the melted snow. Marjorie's gaze flicked toward it. "What's that filthy thing still doing here?" she asked, her voice flat. It was my daddy's gift," Claire murmured. "Then your daddy should have taught you about hygiene," Marjorie snapped, snatching the toy. Before Claire could move, the woman tossed it into the trash bin beside the stove. The sound was small, but to Claire it was thunder. Her throat tightened, but no sound came out. Olivia clapped her hands, oblivious. "Mommy, can I have cocoa?" "Of course, sweetheart," Marjorie said sweetly, her tone switching like light through glass. Outside, the wind howled, and from across the street, Edward Grayson's car idled quietly, his headlights off. He had stopped again, unable to drive past the house. Something in his chest told him this story wasn't over. Through the frosted window, he could just make out a small shadow kneeling beside a trash bin, her hands digging for something soft. He frowned, breath fogging against the glass. In that fleeting moment, he saw her pull out the rabbit, its fur grey, its ear torn again, and hug it close, as if it could still protect her. The image struck through him like ice. Inside, Marjorie's voice echoed faintly through the wall. "You'll never learn if you keep clinging to the past." A door slammed, then silence. Edward gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wanted to walk in to shout to fix it all. But the world didn't work that way, not yet. So he sat there watching the small figure fade into darkness, whispering to himself, "Not tonight, but soon." Snow fell heavier, coating the windshield, and the glow of the house dimmed behind it, as if goodness itself was struggling to survive inside those walls. Edward Grayson had always trusted evidence. Numbers, contracts, reports, those were things he could control. But this wasn't business. This was something that clawed at his conscience every night since he'd left that house. The next morning he parked down the street from the Dawsons again. Snowflakes drifted like ash over his windshield. Through the gate he saw Claire scraping ice off the front steps with a plastic dustpan. She wore no gloves, only a thin sweater that clung wetly to her arms. For a moment Edward told himself to drive away. But then the wind carried a small sound, her cough sharp and dry, and his heart wouldn't let him. He rolled down the window. "Claire," he called softly. She startled, but when she recognized him, her expression lifted. "Mr. Grayson, you came back." He smiled faintly. "Seems I couldn't stay away." Her lips curved, but it didn't reach her eyes. Before Marjorie's shadow appeared behind the curtains, he gestured toward the gate. "Go inside before you catch cold." She nodded and hurried back, clutching something small in her hands, the same stuffed rabbit now patched with uneven stitches. That night, Edward reached out to an old friend, Lydia Morgan, a caseworker at the county's child welfare office. He didn't say much, just asked what it would take for a child's situation to be reviewed. Lydia hesitated. "We'd need more than sympathy, Ed. We need proof photos, statements, medical notes." He paused. "Then I'll find them." Over the next week, Edward followed the routine in silence. Every morning, he stopped near the Dawson home. He documented everything, the hours Claire spent outside, the way she was sent to shovel the walkway long after the snow stopped the bruises near her wrists when she reached for the trash bin. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but denial was a luxury he no longer allowed himself. At the elementary school, he spoke quietly with Mrs. Green, Claire's teacher. "She's a sweet girl," Mrs. Green said, lowering her voice. "Never complains, never talks back. But she's tired. Some days she skips lunch, says she forgot her food, but I think she just doesn't have any. Edward's throat tightened. He left the classroom with his hands trembling, anger slowly replacing sorrow. Later he visited the Dawsons' elderly neighbour, Mr. Howard, who cleared his throat before speaking. I shouldn't get involved, but I've seen her out there in the dark. That woman makes the poor child shovel snow at night. Once I heard the girl crying, said she missed her daddy. Then the lady slapped her. Hard. Edward said nothing. He just looked down at the snow-covered steps where a tiny footprint had frozen into the ice, perfect, fragile, undeniable. Back home, he set the photos on his desk. They were blurry, taken from his car, but they told a story the world needed to see. The one that broke him most was Claire standing by a garbage bin digging for something, her rabbit again half buried in snow. He remembered how his own daughter once lost her favourite toy in a storm. He'd found it for her the next morning. He hadn't been able to save her years later, but maybe, just maybe, he could save this one. That night he called Lydia again. I have what you need, he said simply. She replied. Then we start tomorrow. Edward leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling deep in his chest. Outside his window, the snow kept falling. It no longer looked peaceful. It looked like truth trying to bury itself. He whispered into the silence, almost to himself. I won't let her disappear. And for the first time in years, his voice didn't sound hollow. It sounded like purpose. Marjorie Dawson noticed the car long before she saw the man. Every few days that black Mercedes parked at the same spot across the street, engine quiet, lights dimmed. At first she ignored it. Then one morning, when she spotted the glint of a camera lens through the window, her smile hardened into steel. By evening, she was at her lawyer's office. Luis Ortega, a man known for bending rules when paid enough, listened as she spun her story. He's obsessed with my stepdaughter, she said, lowering her voice to sound afraid. He's been watching us for weeks. My husband was wealthy, Mr. Ortega. I think this man wants something from her inheritance. Ortega scribbled a few notes, smirking. That accusation could ruin him, especially if we make it public first. 2 days later, Edward's world shifted. A headline flashed across a local blog, Millionaire businessman accused of stalking widow and child. Within hours, reporters camped outside his office gates. His investors called, concerned. His assistant avoided eye contact. Even Lydia, the caseworker, sounded uneasy when she phoned that afternoon. Ed, this complicates things. If she's made a statement, we can't move without clearance. I need to check with my supervisor. Edward stood at the window, jaw tight, watching snow swirl over the city skyline. For a moment he thought of giving up, letting the storm swallow the fight. But then he remembered Claire's small voice that night in the cemetery. Daddy, I don't want you to be alone. He wasn't the one who needed saving anymore. She was. That night he drove to the school. Mrs. Green, the teacher, met him in the empty hallway. I heard what's going around, she said softly. Don't let it stop you. That girl needs someone brave enough to care. She handed him a folded paper, a drawing Claire had made that day. On it, a tall man in a black coat stood beside a small girl holding a rabbit. Above them, in a child's handwriting, were the words, warm now. The next morning, Marjorie went further. She called the police, claiming Edward had tried to lure Claire into his car. When the officers arrived at his office, he didn't resist. He met their questions with steady eyes and quiet resolve. Check the house, he said. Check the bruises, the neighbours, the photos. Then tell me who's dangerous. The officers exchanged glances, unsure. His tone wasn't defensive. It was weary, honest, unshakable. As they left, Lydia called again. "We're moving forward. The department has seen the footage. You did the right thing." Edward exhaled his breath, trembling against the phone. "Then let's finish this," he said. Outside, the storm had stopped. The world looked quiet, but he knew that silence was only the calm before the reckoning. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and cold coffee. Outside, snow still drifted in lazy spirals, catching in the iron rails. Inside, the air was heavy with whispers. Reporters filled the benches, ready for another scandal headline, "The Millionaire and the Widow." Edward sat in silence at the defence table. Across from him, Marjorie Dawson adjusted her pearl necklace, her face composed in a mask of sorrow. Beside her, Ortega whispered last-minute instructions, his voice dripping confidence. To the cameras, she was perfect, tragic, graceful, misunderstood. To Edward, she looked exactly as she was, the storm behind a polished window. When the judge entered, the murmurs died. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Lydia sat in the back, hands folded tight, as the prosecutor stood. "Your Honour, this case concerns not wealth or property, but the safety of a child named Claire Dawson." Marjorie's lawyer rose smoothly. "Objection, Your Honour. My client is a grieving widow. The accusations are the product of Mr. Grayson's unhealthy obsession." Edward didn't flinch. He simply reached into his briefcase and placed a small USB drive on the table. "Then let the court decide," he said quietly. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage began to play on the monitor. The first clip showed Claire shoveling snow alone, her breath fogging in the freezing air. The next, a faint slap muffled crying Marjorie's voice, sharp and cruel. "You're a burden, Claire. Even your father couldn't stand you." Gasps filled the courtroom. Marjorie's mask cracked her eyes, darting toward Ortega. He shifted uncomfortably. Then came the third clip, the one Edward could hardly bear to watch again. Claire kneeling beside the trash bin, digging through snow until her fingers bled, whispering, "It's okay, Mr. Rabbit. I found you." The room went silent. Even the judge's expression softened. Marjorie sprang up, voice trembling. "Those videos are edited. He's manipulating everyone." The judge's gavel struck. "Enough, Mrs. Dawson. Sit down." Claire was brought in next, escorted by a child advocate. She looked small in the vast room, her rabbit held tightly against her chest. The judge leaned forward. "Claire, sweetheart, can you tell us the truth? Did anyone hurt you?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked at Edward, his eyes steady, kind, unwavering. She took a breath. "Sometimes," she said, "I made Daddy die. She took my rabbit and threw it away. But Mr. Grayson, he found me." Her voice cracked. "I just wanted to go home. Somewhere warm." Tears welled up in Lydia's eyes. Even one of the reporters lowered his camera. The judge nodded slowly, then turned to the clerk. "Record this custody of Claire Dawson is revoked from Mrs. Dawson and placed temporarily under the guardianship of Mr. Edward Grayson." The gavel fell once more. The sound echoed like a final break in the storm. Marjorie slumped back, her face pale, her perfect hair dishevelled. Edward exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment, his hands trembling not from fear, but release. As he walked out of the courtroom, Claire reached for his hand. It fit perfectly in his small, cold, but alive. Outside, the first light of afternoon broke through the grey clouds. Snow was still falling, but softer now, like the world itself was ready to forgive. The mansion that had once echoed with silence now carried the faint sound of laughter. It wasn't loud or constant, just a small, careful laughter, like the first flame after a long winter. For the first time in years, Edward Grayson had to remind himself to smile back. It started with little things. Claire left her shoes by the fireplace to dry, and he didn't move them. She scribbled drawings on scrap paper. Rabbits, snowflakes, and a tall man with a kind smile, and he pinned them to the refrigerator like priceless art. Every morning she waited for him at the breakfast table, her legs swinging above the chair, the stuffed rabbit always seated beside her like an honoured guest. Emily, the housekeeper, who'd stayed through Edward's loneliest years, watched quietly from the kitchen door. "She's bringing the light back," she murmured one night, wiping her eyes when no one saw. One Sunday afternoon, snow still glittered on the windowsill, while sunlight filtered softly through lace curtains. Edward sat by the fire, reading when Claire appeared, holding a small sewing kit. "Mr. Grayson," she said shyly, "can you help me fix his other ear?" She held up the rabbit, its right ear torn this time. He smiled. "Let's see what we can do." They sat together at the table, the ticking of the clock filling the quiet. Edward guided her tiny hands with his larger ones, threading the needle, showing her how to loop and pull. The rabbit's ear stood crooked but whole again. Claire grinned proud. "Daddy used to fix things that way," she whispered. Edward's voice softened. "I guess now we both do." Later that evening they baked cookies badly. Flour dusted her hair like snow. One tray burned completely black. But the smell of sugar and laughter filled corners of the house that hadn't felt alive in a decade. At night, Claire placed the rabbit beside her pillow. When Edward came to check on her, she was already half asleep, her small voice drifting through the quiet. "Thank you for not leaving." He brushed her hair gently. "No one's leaving anymore, sweetheart." As he turned off the lamp, he paused, watching her face in the glow of the nightlight. It struck him how much peace could come from something as fragile as trust. Down the hall, he stopped by a photo on the wall, his late daughter's smile framed in gold. For the first time, he didn't feel guilt when he looked at it. He whispered, "She's safe now. I promise." Outside, snow was melting from the eaves, dripping softly onto the stone steps. The house seemed to exhale a long, tired breath, finally freed from the cold. Snow fell again that night, softer this time, like the sky was tucking the world into rest. The fire in the living room burned low, flickering against the windows, where frost had begun to fade. Edward sat on the couch with a book open but unread. Beside him, Claire was curled under a blanket, her stuffed rabbit tucked between them. The room smelled of cocoa and pine of peace reclaimed. She stirred and looked up at him sleepily. "Mr. Grayson." "Yes, sweetheart." Her voice was small but steady now. "Do you think my daddy knows I'm okay now?" The question hung in the air, fragile, honest. Edward closed the book and took her hand, feeling the warmth that had once been missing from his own life. "I think he does," he said softly. "And I think he's proud of you. More than words can say." She smiled faintly, her eyes shining in the glow of the fire. Then she whispered, "And he's proud of you too." He swallowed, unable to speak for a moment. That sentence pierced deeper than any he had heard in years, because somewhere beneath the grief he knew she was right. His daughter would have been proud too of this house, this healing, this small act of love that refused to die. Outside, the storm finally stopped. The air was still clean and full of light from the street lamps reflecting off the snow. Edward rose quietly, pulling the curtain aside. The world looked different now, not fixed, not perfect, but alive. Behind him, Claire's soft breathing filled the silence. He turned back, watching her sleep with the rabbit pressed to her chest. In that moment, he understood something he'd forgotten long ago. He hadn't saved her alone, she had saved him too. He whispered into the dim room, "No more dark." The words lingered like a prayer, melting into the crackle of the fire. The clock ticked softly and a snowflake landed against the glass, one last fragile spark that refused to melt. Edward smiled. Somewhere in the quiet, he felt a peace deeper than silence itself. The kind that comes when justice has been done, and love has done the rest. Because in a world that can be so cold, sometimes all it takes to change everything is stopping for one child crying in the snow. In moments of silence like Claire's, or in the courage to care like Edward's, have you ever witnessed kindness break through the cold? A truth exposed a heart, defended a hand that didn't look away. If you ever had a Claire near you, someone small, scared, or unseen, what would you do today to ease her fear, to remind her that the world still has gentle people in it? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, because even a single line from you could be the light guiding someone who feels lost tonight. And I also want to check in with you. How have you been lately? Did this story make your chest tighten or bring a tear when the snow began to fall again? If your day feels a little heavy, I hope this ending gives you a touch of warmth. Our channel will always be here to listen, to share, and to remind you that kindness still exists. So please leave a comment and share this story so more hearts can find it. Thank you for being here. With every view, every word you leave, you help us keep telling stories that heal, stories that whisper what we all need to remember. At the end of every long road after the storm and the silence, the light is always waiting.